My ex-girlfriend assumed she could take my emotional support cat to hurt me during our breakup, but she didn't know the cat was microchipped in my name, and I'd already filed a police report. I was staring at the empty cat bed when Officer Diana Reeves knocked on my door at 9:47 p.m. on a Friday night. She had short auburn hair pulled into a tight bun and the kind of weathered expression that comes from 15 years of patrol work. She held a clipboard and asked if I was Nathan Cross. When I nodded, she asked if I'd filed a report about a stolen pet. My throat went dry because I knew what that meant. Jenna had actually done it. She'd walked into my apartment 3 days ago while I was at work, used the key I'd forgotten to ask for back, and taken Oliver. My cat. My emotional support animal. The one living thing that had kept me functional after my brother died 2 years ago. The officer asked me to describe Oliver, and I did, every detail spilling out in a rush. Orange tabby, white paws, green eyes, a notch in his left ear from a childhood accident. 7 years old, microchipped. That last word made Officer Reeves look up sharply from her notes. She asked when I'd had him chipped, and I told her 4 years ago, right after I adopted him from the county shelter. She wrote something down and told me that changed everything. I'd been with Jenna for 18 months when things started falling apart. We met at a coffee shop near the university where I worked as an IT systems administrator. She was a graduate student in marketing, always impeccably dressed, always armed with a smile that could disarm anyone. Those first 6 months were perfect, or what I thought was perfect. She'd come over to my apartment and Oliver would curl up between us on the couch while we watched movies. She always said she loved how gentle he was, how he seemed to sense when someone needed comfort. I should have seen the warning signs earlier. The way she'd get irritated when I needed to spend time alone to decompress. How she'd make passive-aggressive comments about my anxiety medication. The subtle digs about how I relied too much on my cat for emotional support instead of just getting over my brother's death. Looking back now, with the clarity that only devastation brings, I can see she never actually cared about Oliver. She cared about controlling me. And when I finally worked up the courage to end things after she crossed a line by criticizing my family at Thanksgiving dinner, she smiled sweetly and said she understood. She left that night, took her things over the next 2 days, and I thought that was it. Clean break. Mutual respect. I was naive. The first sign something was wrong came on that Wednesday afternoon. I got home from work around 5:30 p.m. like always, carrying groceries and my laptop bag. The apartment felt wrong the moment I opened the door. Too quiet. Oliver always greeted me at the door, meowing and weaving between my legs until I fed him, but the apartment was silent. I called his name, setting down the groceries in the kitchen and walking through each room. The bedroom, the bathroom, the spare room I used as an office. Nothing. His food bowl was full from the morning, untouched. His water bowl hadn't been disturbed. The litter box was clean from when I'd scooped it that morning. And his favorite blue collar with the bell was gone from the hook by the door where I always hung it after brushing him. That's when my stomach dropped. I checked every closet, every cabinet, under the bed, behind the washing machine. Cats hide when they're sick or scared, I told myself. But I knew. Deep in my gut, I knew. Because the spare key I'd given Jenna was gone from the kitchen drawer where I'd stupidly left it after she returned it, or so I thought. She'd made a copy. She'd waited until I was at work, and she'd taken the one thing she knew would destroy me. I called her immediately, hands shaking as I pulled up her contact. It rang 4 times before she answered with a casual, "Hey, what's up?" Like we were still together, like everything was normal. I asked her directly if she'd been to my apartment. She paused, just a beat too long, before saying no. I asked about Oliver. Another pause. Then she said she didn't know what I was talking about, her voice perfectly calibrated to sound confused and slightly concerned, like I was being irrational. I told her his collar was missing, he was missing, and I knew she had a key. She laughed. Actually laughed. She said I was being paranoid and accusatory, that this was exactly why we broke up, because I was always so anxious and suspicious. She asked if I'd checked with neighbors or considered he might have slipped out. I lived on the 4th floor of a building with security doors. Oliver was an indoor cat who was terrified of hallways. She knew that. We'd talked about it dozens of times. I told her I was going to call the police and she went quiet. Then she said in this cold, measured tone that I should be very careful about making accusations I couldn't prove. She hung up. I stood there in my kitchen, phone in hand, looking at Oliver's empty bed, and something in me fractured. But I didn't fall apart. Not yet. I took photos of everything. The empty bed, the full food bowl, the undisturbed litter box, the missing collar hook. I checked my building's security footage by calling the property manager, a perpetually stressed man named Lawrence Kim, who'd always been responsive to tenant issues. He let me come down to the office at 7 p.m., and we reviewed the footage together on his grainy monitor. There she was. Wednesday at 1:15 p.m., Jenna walking into my building, letting herself in with a key card that shouldn't have worked because I deactivated her guest access after the breakup. Except I hadn't, I realized with creeping horror. I'd forgotten to email the property management company. We watched her walk to the elevator, carrying a large canvas tote bag. 43 minutes later, she emerged from the elevator, the bag now bulging and moving. Lawrence froze the frame, zoomed in. You could see Oliver's face pressed against the mesh panel of a cat carrier inside the bag. The timestamp read 1:58 p.m. Lawrence asked if I wanted him to call the police, and I said yes. He printed the footage stills while I sat there, numbness spreading through my chest like frost. Officer Diana Reeves arrived at 9:15 p.m. after I'd called the non-emergency line and filed a formal report. She took my statement, looked at the security photos, examined the documentation from Oliver's adoption and his veterinary records, which I kept in a labeled folder because I was that kind of organized. She asked about the microchip, and I pulled up my account on the PetLink registry, showing her Oliver's chip number, my name listed as owner, my contact information, the registration date from 4 years ago. She photographed every document with her phone, filling out what seemed like endless forms on her clipboard. When she asked why Jenna would do this, I explained about the breakup, about Oliver being my emotional support animal. I showed her the letter from my psychiatrist, Dr. Leah Thornton, who I'd been seeing for 3 years since my brother's death. The letter detailed my diagnoses, my treatment plan, and Oliver's role in my mental health management. Officer Reeves's expression softened. She said most pet theft cases were crimes of opportunity or financial motivation, but this was clearly targeted emotional abuse. She said that in the state of Oregon, where we lived, pets are considered property, but the microchip in my name was irrefutable proof of ownership. She told me she'd file the report immediately and follow up with Jenna within 24 hours. Officer Reeves asked me more questions, documenting everything with meticulous detail. She wanted to know exactly when I'd given Jenna a key, whether I'd ever put her name on any veterinary paperwork, if we'd ever discussed Oliver's ownership status. I answered each question carefully. No, Jenna had never been on any official documents. No, we'd never had conversations about shared ownership. The key had been for convenience during our relationship, nothing more. Officer Reeves made notes about the timeline, about how I'd adopted Oliver years before meeting Jenna, about the ESA designation predating our relationship by 18 months. She explained that Oregon had specific statutes regarding theft of service animals and emotional support animals, carrying enhanced penalties beyond simple property theft. The fact that Dr. Thornton's letter explicitly stated Oliver was necessary for my mental health treatment elevated this from a civil dispute to potentially criminal conduct. She also mentioned that the unauthorized entry into my apartment, even with a key I'd previously given her, could constitute criminal trespass since our relationship had ended, and she no longer had implied permission to enter. She asked if I wanted to pursue that charge, and I said yes, absolutely. Every charge that fit her actions. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed, staring at my phone, alternating between rage and grief. Oliver had been with me through the worst period of my life. When my younger brother Austin died in a car accident at 23, I'd fallen into a depression so deep I could barely function. I'd go to work, come home, and lie on the couch in the dark. It was my mother who suggested I get a pet, something to care for, something to give me a reason to maintain routines. I adopted Oliver from the county shelter on a Saturday afternoon in February, 3 months after Austin's funeral. He was 4 years old then, a surrender from an elderly owner who'd moved into assisted living. The shelter staff said he was gentle and affectionate, good with anxiety. They were right. Oliver became my anchor. He'd wake me up at 6 a.m. every morning, demanding breakfast, forcing me out of bed. He'd sit on my lap while I worked from home, purring steadily, a warm weight that reminded me I wasn't alone. When panic attacks hit, when the grief felt like drowning, I'd bury my face in his fur and breathe until the world stopped spinning. Dr. Thornton had written the ESA letter after 6 months, noting the measurable improvement in my mental health. Oliver wasn't just a pet, he was medical support, and Jenna had stolen him knowing exactly what it would do to me. The next day, Thursday, I called in sick to work. I couldn't focus. I called every animal shelter within a 50-mile radius, giving them Oliver's description and chip number, asking them to flag any orange tabby intake. I posted on every local lost pet Facebook group with photos and a reward offer of $500. I printed flyers. I called Jenna 7 times. She didn't answer. I texted her, keeping my messages factual and non-threatening because Officer Reeves had warned me that anything I said could be used against me if this went to court. I need Oliver back. He's my ESA. You know this. Please respond. I'm worried about him. The police have been contacted. Returning him now would resolve this peacefully. Nothing. Radio silence. At 4:30 p.m., Officer Reeves called me. She'd gone to Jenna's apartment, the same place I'd driven past twice that afternoon like a stalker, debating whether to pound on the door myself. Jenna hadn't answered when Officer Reeves knocked. The officer had left a card and a formal notice requiring Jenna to contact the police department within 48 hours regarding the pet theft investigation. She told me to be patient, that these situations often resolved quickly once the legal pressure started. But I could hear the doubt in her voice. Friday morning, I was a wreck. I'd lost 6 pounds in 3 days from not eating. My hands shook constantly. I kept checking my phone every 30 seconds, hoping for a message from Jenna, from Officer Reeves, from a shelter, from anyone. At 10 a.m., I got a call from a veterinary clinic I'd never heard of, Riverside Animal Hospital, located 20 miles south in a suburb I rarely visited. The receptionist, who introduced herself as Angela, said they had an orange tabby that had been brought in for vaccines the previous day. The owner had claimed the cat was unregistered, but when they scanned for a chip, they found one. In my name. Angela said she'd called the number on the chip registry and was required by law to inform me. I asked if the cat was still there, and she said no. The owner had left with the animal after the appointment. I asked who the owner was. Angela hesitated, citing privacy concerns, but I explained the situation, the police report, the theft. She put me on hold. 3 minutes later, she came back and said the owner's name on the appointment paperwork was Jenna Lawson, my ex. My vision blurred. I asked if they'd called the police, and Angela said they were required to report chip discrepancies, but hadn't done so yet. I begged her to call Officer Reeves, and she agreed. That Friday afternoon, Officer Reeves called me with an update that changed everything. Riverside Animal Hospital had contacted her with the chip information and the appointment records. The vet clinic had photos from the exam showing Oliver, confirming his identity. Oregon law was clear, Officer Reeves explained. The microchip registry was legal proof of ownership. Jenna was in possession of stolen property. But here's where it got complicated. Jenna was now claiming she'd been co-owner of Oliver, that we'd adopted him together, that I was retroactively trying to claim sole ownership out of spite. She'd apparently told the veterinary staff at Riverside that we'd broken up and she'd taken their shared pet. This was a complete fabrication. I'd adopted Oliver 2 years before I even met Jenna. I had all the original paperwork from the county shelter, the adoption fee receipt with only my name, the initial vet records from before Jenna existed in my life. Officer Reeves said this was now moving beyond simple pet theft into potential fraud and false statements. She recommended I hire a lawyer, not just for the criminal case, but because Jenna might try to claim civil ownership rights. She gave me the name of an attorney who specialized in animal law cases, which apparently was a real specialty. I called immediately. Officer Reeves also mentioned something that made my blood run cold. She'd spoken with the veterinary staff at Riverside more extensively after they filed their report. According to the veterinary technician who'd handled the appointment, a woman named Stephanie Chen who'd worked there for 8 years, Jenna had seemed nervous and evasive during the visit. When they scanned Oliver and found the chip registered to someone else, Jenna had insisted there must be a mistake, that her ex-boyfriend must have somehow registered the chip fraudulently after their breakup. She'd claimed I was vindictive and controlling, that I was using the microchip to harass her. Stephanie had documented these statements in the appointment notes, which were now part of the police file. But here's what concerned Officer Reeves. During that same appointment, Jenna had asked about having the microchip removed or replaced. The veterinary staff had refused, explaining that altering or removing a registered microchip without documented proof of ownership was illegal and could result in criminal charges for the veterinarian. Jenna had gotten angry, according to Stephanie's notes, and had made veiled threats about reporting the clinic for poor service. The vet staff had remained firm. This attempt to alter the microchip, Officer Reeves explained, showed consciousness of guilt and could be used as evidence of Jenna's knowledge that she didn't legitimately own Oliver. The attorney's name was Gordon Blackwell, a partner at a small firm downtown that handled unusual property disputes, including pet custody cases. He'd been practicing for 22 years, and his receptionist got me an emergency consultation for 4 p.m. that same day. I drove to his office in a daze, carrying a manila folder stuffed with every document related to Oliver. Gordon was in his 50s, wearing a rumpled suit and glasses that kept sliding down his nose, with the kind of tired competence that comes from seeing every variation of human pettiness. He listened to my story without interrupting, occasionally jotting notes. When I finished, he asked to see my documentation. He spent 20 minutes reviewing the adoption papers, the initial vet records dated years before I met Jenna, the microchip registration, Dr. Thornton's ESA letter, the building security footage, the police report. Then he leaned back in his chair and said, I had the strongest ownership case he'd seen in years. The microchip alone was nearly bulletproof. But he warned me this would get nasty. If Jenna was already lying to veterinarians and police, she'd likely lie in court. He said we needed to file for an emergency civil order for property return, which in Oregon could be done for high-value property or property with special significance. An emotional support animal qualified. Gordon explained the legal landscape in detail, wanting me to understand exactly what we were facing. Oregon, like most states, treated pets as personal property rather than as beings with their own rights, which meant the dispute would be handled through property law rather than custody law. However, the emotional support animal designation gave us additional legal grounds beyond simple property ownership. He cited several recent Oregon cases where courts had recognized the special status of service animals and ESAs in property disputes. In one case from 2019, a judge had awarded expedited return of an ESA to its owner, specifically because of the documented mental health impact of separation. Gordon said we'd be arguing on multiple grounds. First, clear ownership through the microchip and adoption records. Second, the unauthorized taking of property. Third, the enhanced harm caused by removing a medical support animal. And fourth, potential bad faith on Jenna's part, given her false statements to the veterinary clinic. He pulled up Oregon Revised Statute 167.315, which dealt with animal theft, and showed me that theft of a service animal, or ESA, carried enhanced penalties compared to theft of a regular pet. The statute explicitly recognized that such animals had value beyond their monetary worth due to their role in supporting disabled individuals. We filed the emergency motion that evening. Gordon worked fast, drafting a petition that detailed the theft, the documentation of ownership, and the harm being caused by Oliver's absence. He attached Dr. Thornton's letter and a new letter he had me get that same day from my psychiatrist, who I'd called in a panic. Dr. Thornton responded immediately, meeting me at her office at 6:30 p.m. after her last appointment. She wrote a detailed letter explaining that Oliver's sudden removal was causing severe psychological distress, exacerbating my existing anxiety and depression, and creating a mental health crisis. She noted I'd had to increase my medication dosage and was experiencing panic attacks, insomnia, and loss of appetite. She stated that the continued separation from my ESA was causing measurable harm to my mental health and constituted a form of psychological abuse. Gordon attached this to the motion along with the police report and security footage stills. We filed electronically at 8:47 p.m., requesting an emergency hearing. The court clerk called Saturday morning and said we had a hearing scheduled for Monday at 2 p.m. before Judge Carolyn Vance. 48 hours. I had to survive 48 more hours. That weekend was the longest of my life. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep more than 20 or 30 minutes at a time before jolting awake, reaching for Oliver, finding empty space. My apartment felt like a mausoleum. I kept hearing phantom meows, seeing movement in my peripheral vision that disappeared when I turned my head. On Sunday, I had a full-blown panic attack at 3 a.m., hyperventilating on my bathroom floor while trying to use the breathing techniques Dr. Thornton had taught me. Nothing worked. I ended up calling a crisis line and talking to a counselor for 40 minutes until I could breathe normally again. She asked if I was safe and I said yes, but I wasn't sure if I meant it. The only thing keeping me functional was the hearing scheduled for Monday, the possibility of getting Oliver back. On Sunday afternoon, Officer Reeves called with more news. She'd obtained a warrant to check Jenna's apartment for Oliver based on the veterinary clinic evidence. She and another officer had executed it that morning. Jenna wasn't home, but they'd searched the apartment with the landlord's cooperation. No cat, no litter box, no food bowls, no sign Oliver had ever been there. Either Jenna had hidden him somewhere else, or she'd gotten rid of him. The thought made me physically ill. Monday morning, I dressed in the only suit I owned, a navy blue one I'd bought for job interviews years ago. Gordon met me outside the courthouse at 1:30 p.m. He briefed me on courtroom protocol, told me to answer questions directly and calmly, not to let Jenna provoke me. Judge Vance was fair, but no nonsense, he said. She'd review our motion and Jenna's response if she filed one. The hearing would be brief, focused on whether there was enough evidence to order immediate return of the property pending a full hearing. At 1:55 p.m., we entered the courtroom. Jenna was already there with a lawyer I didn't recognize, a sharp-dressed woman in her 30s who looked expensive. My heart sank. Jenna had lawyered up fast, which meant she was taking this seriously. She'd prepared. When Judge Vance entered, we all stood. She was an older black woman with silver hair and reading glasses on a chain, carrying herself with the authority of someone who'd seen it all. She reviewed our motion first, then asked Jenna's attorney to present their response. The attorney, who introduced herself as Nicole Brennan, argued that this was a personal dispute between former romantic partners, that Jenna had legitimate claims to shared ownership of the pet, and that my motion was retaliatory. She claimed I was using the legal system to harass her client. Nicole Brennan had filed a written response that morning, barely meeting the deadline, and she now elaborated on it with smooth confidence. She argued that during the 18-month relationship, Jenna had taken primary responsibility for Oliver's care, purchasing food, toys, and supplies, and taking him to veterinary appointments when I was busy with work. She presented receipts showing Jenna had bought cat food and litter on multiple occasions, credit card statements highlighting purchases at pet stores. She argued these contributions established an equitable ownership interest regardless of whose name appeared on the original adoption papers. Nicole claimed that ownership wasn't simply about initial purchase, but about ongoing investment and care, citing case law from other states. She also argued that my mental health issues, specifically my documented anxiety and depression, raised questions about my fitness to care for an animal properly. She suggested the court should consider Oliver's best interests, not just legal ownership, and that Jenna had removed Oliver from my care out of genuine concern for the animal's welfare given my deteriorating mental state after our breakup. Gordon tensed beside me. I felt my face flush with anger but kept my expression neutral. The implication that my mental health made me unfit to care for Oliver was not only offensive, but contradicted by Dr. Thornton's letter, which explicitly stated that Oliver was part of my mental health treatment plan. Judge Vance listened with an impassive expression, then asked to see the ownership documentation. Gordon handed over the folder. The judge spent 5 minutes reviewing the adoption papers, the microchip registration, the initial veterinary records. Then she looked at Nicole Brennan and asked point-blank what documentation Jenna had to support her ownership claim. Nicole fumbled. She said they had evidence of Jenna caring for the cat, providing food and supplies, bonding with the animal. Judge Vance asked if any of that predated the relationship. Nicole said no, but argued that contributions during the relationship established shared ownership. Judge Vance turned to Jenna directly and asked when she'd first met the cat. Jenna, looking perfectly composed in a gray dress, said about 18 months ago when we started dating. Judge Vance asked when I'd adopted the cat. Before Nicole could object, I said, 4 years ago, Your Honor. I have the original paperwork from the county shelter. Judge Vance nodded slowly. She asked Jenna why her name wasn't on the microchip registry. Jenna said she'd never thought to add herself, that it hadn't seemed important. Judge Vance asked why Jenna had taken the cat from my apartment without my knowledge or permission. Long pause. Jenna said she was worried about Oliver's welfare given my mental health issues. Judge Vance removed her glasses and cleaned them with a cloth, a gesture that somehow felt ominous. She said she'd heard enough. The microchip registry, the original adoption paperwork, and the veterinary records established clear sole ownership. The fact that Jenna had entered my apartment without permission and removed property that wasn't hers, regardless of her stated concerns, constituted theft. The emotional support animal designation elevated the severity. Judge Vance ordered Jenna to immediately produce Oliver and return him to my custody. She set a full hearing for 2 weeks later to address potential damages and any continuing legal issues, but the immediate order was non-negotiable. If Jenna failed to produce Oliver within 24 hours, she would be held in contempt of court and subject to arrest. Nicole Brennan tried to object, arguing they needed time to prepare their case, but Judge Vance cut her off. The microchip was dispositive. The order was effective immediately. Court adjourned at 2:47 p.m. I walked out shaking, Gordon clapping my shoulder and saying that went as well as possible. But I had a terrible feeling in my gut, because if the police hadn't found Oliver at Jenna's apartment, where was he? Jenna ignored the court order. 24 hours passed with no contact, no returned cat. At 3 p.m. on Tuesday, Gordon filed a contempt motion. Judge Vance issued a bench warrant that evening, meaning police could now arrest Jenna for contempt of court. Officer Reeves called me with the news, but also a warning. They still didn't know where Oliver was. Jenna wasn't at her apartment. She'd apparently gone into hiding or at least stopped answering her door. There was a larger problem, too. If Jenna had given Oliver away or abandoned him somewhere, we might never find him. That night, I got a message from an unknown number. It was a photo. Oliver, sitting in what looked like a basement or garage, looking thin and scared. No message, no demands, just the photo. I called Officer Reeves immediately, forwarding the image. She said it was likely intimidation, trying to show she still had control. But it confirmed Oliver was alive. I sent the photo to every animal welfare group I could find, asking if anyone recognized the location. A woman named Rachel DeVries from a local animal rescue organization called me within an hour. She'd seen similar basements in a specific apartment complex near the industrial district, a rundown place known for code violations. She gave me the address. I drove there at 6:30 a.m. Wednesday morning, 6 days after Oliver was taken. The complex was exactly as Rachel described: crumbling brick, broken windows, the smell of mildew and neglect. I walked through the parking lot, looking at every car, trying to spot Jenna's silver Nissan. I found it on the east side, parked in a space marked for Unit 2B. My hands started shaking again. I called Officer Reeves, told her the location. She said she'd send units immediately, but warned me not to approach or enter the property. I agreed, but I was lying. I couldn't wait. I walked to Unit 2B and knocked. No answer. I knocked harder. A neighbor emerged from 2C, an older Hispanic man in a bathrobe who asked what I wanted. I explained I was looking for someone who'd stolen my cat, that I had a court order. He studied me for a long moment, then said the woman in 2B had been keeping a cat in the storage unit in the basement, that he'd heard it crying at night. He said it wasn't right, keeping an animal down there. He gave me directions to the basement access. I should have waited for the police. I know that now. But I was terrified Jenna would move Oliver again if she knew I'd found the location. I went to the basement. The door was unlocked. The basement was dark, lit only by a few bare bulbs hanging from the ceiling. It smelled like mold and cat urine. There were storage cages along the walls, chain-link partitions separating each unit's space. I walked past bicycles, old furniture, boxes of junk, and then I heard it. A meow, weak and plaintive. I ran toward the sound, my phone flashlight sweeping across the darkness. In the far corner, in a storage unit marked 2B, I saw him. Oliver was in a plastic pet carrier, far too small, with no water bowl visible, a litter box that hadn't been cleaned, and a food dish with what looked like a few dried kibbles. He looked thin, his fur matted, and when he saw me, he started crying, that desperate sound cats make when they're in distress. The storage cage was locked with a padlock. I pulled at it uselessly, then looked around for something to break it. I found a metal pipe and started smashing the padlock, hitting it over and over until the metal bent and the lock popped free. I wrenched open the cage door, then opened the carrier. Oliver practically fell into my arms, meowing and purring simultaneously, pressing his face against mine. He was lighter than I remembered. His ribs were visible. I held him and cried right there in that horrible basement, relief and rage flooding through me in equal measure. The carrier itself was filthy, lined with newspaper that was soaked through with urine. The litter box was a cheap disposable aluminum pan filled with clumped litter that hadn't been changed in days. The smell was overwhelming. Oliver's fur was sticky in places, matted with what might have been his own waste. His eyes looked sunken, his third eyelid partially visible, a sign of dehydration or illness. I checked him over frantically, running my hands over his body looking for injuries. No obvious wounds, but he was so thin. His hip bones protruded sharply. His spine was a ridge of knobs under my fingers. I could count his ribs easily. In 6 days, she'd let him deteriorate to this condition. 6 days of being trapped in a carrier barely large enough for him to turn around, in a dark basement, with inadequate food and water. I thought about the photo she'd sent, the one meant to intimidate me. Had she been keeping him like this the whole time? Or had she moved him here recently, stashing him in this storage unit to hide him from the police and the court order? Either way, this was deliberate cruelty. This was punishing an innocent animal to hurt me. I held Oliver close, whispering to him that he was safe now, that I had him, that no one would hurt him again. Officer Reeves found me 10 minutes later, still sitting on the concrete floor with Oliver wrapped in my jacket. She had 2 other officers with her, and they'd already arrested Jenna upstairs in the apartment where she'd apparently been sleeping. Officer Reeves photographed the storage cage, the carrier, the condition Oliver was in. She said this had escalated from pet theft to animal cruelty and contempt of court. Jenna was being charged with all 3. An animal control officer arrived to document Oliver's condition and clear him for transport. She examined him, noting dehydration, weight loss, and possible neglect-related health issues. She gave me temporary paperwork, allowing me to take him directly to a veterinary emergency clinic for evaluation. I drove straight to the closest emergency vet, carrying Oliver in my arms because I couldn't bear to put him in the carrier again. The vet on duty, Dr. Kevin Arroyo, had 15 years of emergency experience. He examined Oliver, ran blood work, and told me Oliver was dehydrated and undernourished, but would recover with proper care. He'd lost nearly 2 pounds in 6 days. Dr. Arroyo gave him subcutaneous fluids, high-calorie food, and prescribed medications for stress-related digestive issues. He wrote a detailed report documenting the neglect for the police case. Officer Reeves arrived at the emergency clinic about an hour after I did, while Dr. Arroyo was still treating Oliver. She had more questions, documenting every detail of what I'd found in the basement. She took additional photos of Oliver under the clinic's bright lights, showing the matted fur, the visible ribs, the sunken eyes. Dr. Arroyo provided a verbal statement that Officer Reeves recorded, describing Oliver's condition in medical terms. Moderate to severe dehydration, indicated by skin tenting and tacky mucous membranes. Significant weight loss, approximately 15 to 20% of healthy body weight. Evidence of urine scalding on the hind legs and belly from prolonged contact with soiled bedding. Stress-related gastrointestinal symptoms, including diarrhea. Dr. Arroyo explained that 6 days without adequate water could have been fatal, especially given the poor ventilation in the basement. He said Oliver was lucky I'd found him when I did. Another day or 2 in those conditions could have resulted in kidney failure or death from dehydration. This wasn't just neglect, Dr. Arroyo stated clearly for the recording. This was a life-threatening situation. Officer Reeves asked if Dr. Arroyo would be willing to testify in court if necessary, and he agreed immediately. He said cases of deliberate animal cruelty, especially when used as a weapon in personal disputes, deserved prosecution. He'd testified in animal cruelty cases before and understood the legal process. The next 2 weeks were a blur of recovery and legal proceedings. Oliver slowly regained weight, his fur returned to its normal healthy shine, and he stopped flinching every time I moved near him. But he wasn't the same. He followed me everywhere now, panicking if I left his sight. He cried if I closed a door between us. Dr. Thornton said he was experiencing trauma and would need time to feel secure again. I worked from home, taking leave time to be with him constantly. We had a routine. I'd sit at my desk with Oliver on my lap, one hand typing while the other stroked his fur. At night, he slept pressed against my chest, like he was afraid I'd disappear if he didn't maintain contact. Slowly, day by day, I watched him heal. And I healed too. The panic attacks lessened. The insomnia improved. Having Oliver back was like having a missing organ reattached. Jenna's criminal case moved forward. She was charged with second-degree theft, animal cruelty, contempt of court, and making false statements to law enforcement. Nicole Brennan tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the prosecutor's office wasn't interested. The evidence was overwhelming. The security footage, the microchip records, the veterinary documentation, the photos from the storage cage. Jenna's claim of shared ownership had been thoroughly demolished. Oliver's recovery wasn't just physical. Dr. Thornton recommended I take him to a veterinary behaviorist, a specialist in animal psychology and trauma recovery. The behaviorist, Dr. Amanda Strauss, had a doctorate in veterinary medicine with additional certification in animal behavior. She'd worked with abuse cases for over a decade. I brought Oliver to her office 3 weeks after getting him back. Dr. Strauss observed Oliver's behavior, noting the separation anxiety, the hypervigilance, the way he startled at sudden movements. She explained that animals, like humans, could develop post-traumatic stress responses after traumatic experiences. Being removed from his home, kept in inadequate conditions, isolated from his primary caregiver, these were all traumatic events for a cat who'd previously lived in a stable, loving environment. Dr. Strauss developed a treatment plan involving environmental enrichment, predictable routines, and gradual desensitization exercises. She taught me techniques to help Oliver feel more secure, like creating multiple safe spaces throughout the apartment, using pheromone diffusers to reduce stress, and engaging in structured play sessions to rebuild his confidence. She also wrote a supplemental report for the court case, documenting the psychological harm Oliver had suffered and the ongoing treatment required for his recovery. This report would be crucial in establishing the full extent of damages in the civil case. The full civil hearing happened 2 weeks after I got Oliver back. Judge Vance heard testimony from me, from Officer Reeves, from Dr. Arroyo, and from Dr. Thornton. Gordon presented the full timeline with documentation at every step. Nicole Brennan tried to argue that Jenna's actions, while misguided, came from genuine concern about my mental health and Oliver's welfare. Judge Vance asked her directly how keeping an emotional support animal in a dark storage cage with minimal food and water demonstrated concern for the animal's welfare. Nicole had no answer. Judge Vance ruled in my favor on every count. She affirmed sole ownership, ordered Jenna to pay restitution for veterinary bills, legal fees, and damages related to the emotional distress caused. The total came to $15,000. She also issued a permanent restraining order prohibiting Jenna from coming within 500 feet of me or Oliver. The criminal case went to trial 3 months later. I testified, describing the theft, the days of terror not knowing where Oliver was, the condition I found him in. The jury deliberated for 90 minutes, guilty on all counts. Jenna was sentenced to 1 year in jail with 6 months suspended, 3 years of probation, and ordered to complete anger management and mental health counseling. She was also banned from owning pets for 5 years. The trial itself lasted 3 days. The prosecution, led by Deputy District Attorney Karen Fujimoto, built a methodical case that left no room for doubt. Day 1 focused on establishing the theft and false ownership claims. The jury heard from me, from Officer Reeves, from Lawrence Kim, who managed my apartment building, and from Stephanie Chen from Riverside Animal Hospital. Each witness provided a piece of the puzzle. The security footage was played on a large monitor, showing Jenna entering my building with her tote bag, returning with the bulging carrier. Lawrence testified about how I'd forgotten to revoke Jenna's guest access, a detail that proved critical because it meant she'd entered using credentials she knew were no longer valid after our breakup. Stephanie testified about Jenna's attempt to have the microchip removed or altered, her false claims about ownership, her aggressive demeanor when refused. Karen Fujimoto methodically walked through the timeline, the documentation, the false statements, building a picture of deliberate deception and theft. Nicole Brennan cross-examined each witness, trying to establish that Jenna had genuinely believed she had some ownership rights, that her actions came from concern rather than malice. But the evidence was too strong. The original adoption papers, the microchip registered years before Jenna and I met, the veterinary records spanning 4 years with only my name, all of it contradicted any claim of shared ownership. Day 2 focused on the animal cruelty charges. Dr. Arroyo testified about Oliver's condition when I brought him to the emergency clinic, showing photos that made several jury members visibly upset. He described the dehydration, the weight loss, the urine scalding, the life-threatening nature of the conditions. Dr. Strauss testified about the psychological trauma, explaining how the isolation and neglect had impacted Oliver's behavior and would require ongoing treatment. The animal control officer who documented the scene in the basement storage unit testified about the inadequate space, the lack of proper ventilation, the filthy conditions. Karen Fujimoto introduced photos of the carrier, the soiled newspaper, the nearly empty food dish. She asked each expert whether these conditions met the standard for adequate animal care. Each answered no. Day 3 was closing arguments and the contempt charge. Karen Fujimoto argued that Jenna had not only stolen Oliver, but had deliberately hidden him to avoid complying with Judge Vance's order, showing contempt for the legal system and continued intent to harm me through Oliver. Nicole Brennan gave it her best effort, arguing that Jenna had been scared and confused, that she'd made mistakes under emotional distress, that jail time was excessive. The jury wasn't convinced. 6 months later, Oliver and I have settled into a new normal. He's back to his healthy weight, his fur is glossy, and he's started playing with his old toys again. He still follows me everywhere, still sleeps on my chest, but the frantic edge to it has dulled. He's healing. So am I. I've processed the betrayal, the deliberate cruelty of what Jenna did. Dr. Thornton says it's a form of intimate partner abuse, using something precious to cause psychological harm. I've learned to recognize those patterns now, to see the red flags I missed before. My apartment feels safe again. I had the locks changed, obviously. I installed a security camera pointed at the door. I'm not paranoid, just prepared. The microchip that saved everything is still there, embedded under Oliver's skin, a tiny piece of technology that proved ownership when it mattered most. I check the registry every few months, making sure all the information is current, that my address and phone number are updated. It's a small thing, but it gave me back what I thought I'd lost forever. Oliver is curled up next to me right now as I finish writing this, purring steadily, completely unaware of the legal battles fought over his custody. He just knows he's home, and that's all that matters. Jenna tried to hurt me by taking the thing I loved most, thinking she could break me with that loss. But she underestimated 2 things: the strength of the bond between a person and their emotional support animal, and the power of a microchip that can't be argued with. She lost everything in trying to take him from me. I got back what mattered. That's justice. The civil settlement finalized last month, and Gordon managed to secure compensation beyond what Judge Vance had initially ordered. The final amount included restitution for veterinary bills totaling $3,400, legal fees of $8,200, compensation for emotional distress of $10,000, and punitive damages of $5,000 for the deliberate nature of Jenna's actions. The total of $26,600 would be paid through garnished wages over the next 5 years. Gordon said we could have pushed for more, but I told him I didn't want to spend years fighting over money. I wanted closure. The restraining order remains in effect indefinitely, and Jenna's criminal record will follow her permanently. That's enough. I've also become an advocate for microchipping. I've spoken at 2 local animal shelters about the importance of registering chips and keeping information current. The shelter where I adopted Oliver asked me to share my story at their volunteer training, explaining how that tiny chip saved Oliver's life and secured his return. I've helped 3 other people navigate similar disputes over pet ownership, connecting them with Gordon and explaining the legal process. It turns out pet theft and custody battles are more common than I realized, especially during breakups. But most people don't have the documentation I had, don't have proof of ownership that's as clear as a microchip. I tell everyone the same thing now. Microchip your pets, register the chip in your name, keep the documentation organized, and update it whenever you move. That tiny piece of preparation can mean everything. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.